In the quiet town of Garanhuns, police uncovered a trio living behind an unsettling facade. One that involved missing women, a bizarre belief system, and homemade pastries that would soon become the centre of a nightmare. What investigators discovered inside that home would reveal a level of manipulation and cruelty almost impossible to comprehend. This is the case of the Garanhuns trio, where even the most ordinary details hid something far more sinister. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you're new here. I hope you're all doing so well. Welcome back to another true crime and makeup episode. Oh yeah. If you're new here, my name is Anna. I am a certified yapper, and one day I decided I'm gonna hop on the internet. I'm gonna hop on YouTube, I'm gonna yap about true crime. And now I find myself doing it twice a week, every single week on a Wednesday and Sunday. So, with that being said, if true crime is your jam, I highly suggest that you subscribe, you get the notification bell on because, well, like I said, I'm here for you twice a week, every single week, and it's free. If you do enjoy my content, please don't forget to engage with this video in some way. A like, a comment, a share goes such a long way. It means the world to me. But if you could please, pretty please with a cherry on top, if you could hype up the video, you know, if Daddy YT brings back the hype function to my videos that, you know, they took away, that would be absolutely amazing. It helps boost me out into the algorithm, it helps me reach new audiences, grow the community that we have all worked so hard to grow. If you need any details regarding me, myself and I, they will all be found listed down below. But I think without any further rambling and any further ado, let's get into the horrifying, disturbing ass case of the cannibal throuple. So, before the central loser of this case, before the world called him a cannibal, before he himself had called himself the high priest of his own imaginary religion, Jorge Beltrão Negromonte de Silveira, that's a very long name and I don't know how I did with that, but you let me know in the comments. He was just another kid who was growing up in Recife. Now, he would be raised in a household where accountability was non-existent and reality, that was just an optional thing. Now, he was born on December the 14th, which is my dad's birthday. So let's hide that from our guy Ali, because that might be quite upsetting. But this loser, he was born December the 14th of 1960. He would be raised in a household that was constantly full of tension. Like, it didn't matter what day of the week it is. It didn't matter how well the children performed at school or if the adults had a good day at work. They just did not want to be happy. And we all know that kind of family. Always something to moan about, always something to complain about. The family constantly had tension, but as we know, killers aren't made through instability alone or tension in a household or a few household arguments. But when you mix in instability, neglect, a child with a very fragile ego, and a flair for the dramatic, this is a cocktail that doesn't age very well. From a very young age, Jorge, he would exhibit some traits that people found to be a bit meh, they didn't like them. He wasn't very endearing to anyone. And that was because he loved attention and he wanted to be anything other than ordinary, which, I mean, those two traits alone, is that such a bad thing? Like, didn't we all want a bit of attention as a child? Don't we deserve attention when we're children? But people said it was attention in strange ways. Like at school, his teachers would say that he showed no empathy. There was no vulnerability. He didn't care about anyone. And in fact, it seemed as though he would get attention through hurting other people. Whilst other kids would play at school, he wanted to give these monologues and speeches and performances about how he was a higher up person, about how his future was going to be, how he was going to rise above everyone else and be the main player. And the thing is, if you're going to make all these declarations, if you're going to act like you're the best thing since sliced bread, like the sun shines out your ass, then you need to have some talent to back it up. This man, the talent was not in the room. But regardless of having no talent, he was loud about how amazing he thought he was. And the only way I can describe this guy is like, do you know when a dog chases a motorbike and they're just blindly going after it and they have absolutely no idea what they're going to do when they actually reach the motorcycle? That was like this man. Now, it was said, even in school, in his home life, to any outsiders looking in, he was someone who struggled socially. And it wasn't anything to do with him being shy, because, to be honest, he was quite the opposite. But it was the fact that he would talk at people rather than to people. He had this habit of creating these heroic fantasies about himself as a way to excuse any of his bad behaviour. And in psychology, that's probably deemed to be a budding narcissistic personality structure. But in reality, in normal language, this was just the kind of guy that believes every bit of shit that he spouted out his mouth deserved a round of applause. Even as a teenager, this guy, he just didn't want to interact with anyone. He truly believed that he was on a different level to everyone else. He became immersed in escapism, fantasy books, pseudo-philosophy, and melodramatic diary entries that, quite honestly, they read like a rejected script for a soap opera. He was all about anything that would allow him to pretend to be far better than what he actually was. From an early age, he wanted to be a thinker, he wanted to be a revolutionary, a leader. But for things like that, you need followers. You can't just have a loud, bold, brass personality and expect everything to fall into place. And his classmates, they had absolutely no interest whatsoever in listening to a guy that cannot take even the tiniest bit of self-criticism without having an existential crisis. So at one point he would enroll into college, he would study education, then he wandered away into the theatre industry, which probably would have suited him better if he was any good at it. He was hoping that going into theatre would feed his ego, that he would get the attention and spotlight that he truly believes he deserved. But you're not going to get that kind of attention and spotlight when you're literally the worst one in the theatre. Because like I said, the guy has no talent. He always started something new, but he never quite finished the thing that he had previously started. It's like every time he realised, oh, you know what? I'm not the best at that. Let me just rebrand, rethink, reconvene, recalibrate, and then walk myself into some other situation. And the thing that's very telling is people would usually grow out of something like this. But Jorge never. He would continue to grow more theatrical, more delusional, more convinced that the universe owed him a destiny. And this is when we come to Izabela Pires da Silveira. And this woman, she herself, she didn't grow up to be a monster on her own. She was born on May the 12th of 1961. She wasn't violent, she wasn't power hungry unlike Jorge, but she had a lifelong habit of attaching herself to people like him, to these stronger personalities, and then mistaking control for love. She had grown up in a very strict environment where obedience, that was far easier than confrontation. And these were habits that would stay with Izabela. When she met Jorge, he was overbearing, he was charismatic, he seemed powerful in Izabela's eyes. He was always full of these big, bold ideas about philosophy, morality, and of course, the universe. He was the kind of guy that, he might be able to sound a bit intelligent as long as you're not listening to him too closely. You need to kind of just switch off somewhere, go to your happy place and let the guy blab. And it probably comes as no shock that the relationship between Izabela and Jorge wasn't one built on romance, because Jorge just wanted a relationship to have someone who validated his every single word. He wanted a follower, and Izabela, she needed someone to follow. She needed guidance. Just the guidance she's going to get with Jorge is not going to be one that's good for society. Their dynamic was very much like he talked, she accepted. He preached, she nodded. He would rewrite his identity on a weekly basis, and she just never questioned why a full grown-ass man would need to have a weekly rebrand. And it's not that Izabela at this point was ignorant. It was just that she was conditioned to find comfort in surrender. And you've got someone like Jorge who just adored having an audience. Even though his audience at this point has one member in it. But that's a lot for him, because no one his whole life has wanted to listen to him. Rightfully so. Apologies, my hair has been a complete pain in the ass, so I'm just tucking it behind my ears and hoping for the best. So over time, Jorge, he is feeding into his delusions. Izabela's not questioning it, which further validates and feeds his delusions. But his ideas started to drift away from normal eccentricity, and it became someone who very much needed to be locked up, monitored and have his journal taken away. As I alluded to earlier, this is a man that's become obsessed with morality. Now he's into purity and sin and control. And these were concepts that he would twist into whatever way fed his BS. And instead of challenging these ideas, it was like Izabela just became an echo chamber to Jorge. And let's be honest, nothing accelerates delusion than like when you have someone that is never willing to tell you that you're wrong or never willing to challenge your delusions. So the pair, they eventually get married, and their marriage had settled into this hierarchy where Jorge, he was this great grand man that no one could understand because he was just all brains, you know? No one's smart enough to understand Jorge, but he didn't care if people understood him. He just wanted to ensure that everyone respected him. And at this point, it's not even a marriage. It is literally the smallest cult we've ever seen, a 2-person cult with no mission as of yet, because we'll get there. But before we get there, we have to meet the final piece of the puzzle, the final member of the throuple, and that is Bruna Cristina Olvera da Silva. Now, Bruna, she was younger, she was more vulnerable, and at this stage in her life, she was desperate to have a sense of belonging. Now, her early life would be marked by vulnerability and instability, the kind that really leaves you hungry to have some direction in your life. She would constantly bounce between jobs and relationships, and she always ended up in these situations that left her feeling invisible. And then she meets Jorge and Izabela, and she doesn't walk into a marriage, she literally walks into a personality vacuum that's got his mouth wide open. And when Jorge seen Bruna, he's seen the thing that he's been desiring all along. Someone impressionable enough to admire him, and vulnerable enough to stay. He would constantly feed her this narrative about spiritual purpose and purity, destiny and higher calling. He painted himself to everyone, and especially Bruna, as this misunderstood intellect, a visionary that the world couldn't handle their brilliance. See what that, like this guy, he is so wrapped up in his own delusion, like he genuinely believes that he is the bee's boss. It's so embarrassing and pathetic. But Bruna, she falls for this completely. She believes that she is stepping into more than just a marriage, more than just a household. She thought that she was stepping into this chosen higher role. So the three of them, they form this emotional ecosystem that really was just built on fueling Jorge's ego. And as you can imagine, this weirdo, he had positioned himself as the leader, the prophet, the thinker. Izabela, her role was to play the loyal wife who would protect Jorge's authority at any cost. And then Bruna had become their devoted follower who completely worshipped Jorge. And at this point is when he begins to write his spiritual doctrine. But in reality, as you can probably imagine, this was just ramblings. Self-serving manifesto about morality and cleansing, and he had named this A Cartilla da Sagrada Feminina. The guy must have thought that this screams legitimacy because it sounds as though it was something stole from a very small cult's pathetic pamphlet. So in his doctrine, this is where he really gets down to business. So he positioned himself as a higher up, the chosen figure whose job it was to purify society, and the way that he would do this was by targeting impure women. And both of these women, Izabela and Bruna, they supported him. And it wasn't because his ideas made sense, because, let me tell you, they frickin' didn't. But because they needed and craved the structure that Jorge appeared to be giving them. So when we talk about how this throuple, can't even believe I'm saying that word in all seriousness, but how they became these cold-blooded murderers, it wasn't something that happened overnight. Jorge really had to brew his obsessions for quite a while before he would fully slip in to cold-hearted evil cretin. So his obsession with moral cleansing, this would deepen over time. His fantasies grew darker, and then he started to frame violence as a necessary step towards some kind of twisted righteousness. And by the time harming someone had eventually crossed Jorge's mind, he had the perfect setup. Izabela adored him, and Bruna, she completely admired him. And Jorge, who had feared his whole life that he was insignificant, because he is, he truly believed that finally he was becoming something and becoming someone. Now, the first young woman that would cross the path of this throuple, She wasn't a young woman who was looking for danger. She wasn't naive, she wasn't reckless, she wasn't doomed since birth. She was simply someone who was trying to survive in the cracks of Brazilian society, where poverty didn't just steal opportunity, it completely stole any options. Her name was Alessandra Falcon, and she had grown up not too far from where Jorge had performed his childhood monologues of prophecy. But unlike Jorge, Alessandra, she actually knew hardship. Her family, they truly struggled and money just never seemed to stretch far enough. And by the time this woman had entered her adulthood, she carried that kind of exhaustion of someone who their entire life has done everything right and still seemed to fall behind. Alessandra had dreams that honestly should just be the basic necessities in life. She dreamed of a stable job, a safe home, and a life where she wasn't constantly calculating which bill could maybe wait another week. She worked hard and she worked whenever she could, wherever she could. Usually the jobs that she was able to get, they were temporary and they were low paying, and she always had that stress of trying to find something stable and something concrete. This woman, she was so smart. Everyone said that she was smart, she was resilient. But society doesn't seem to reward that when you're born at the bottom of the social pyramid. Now, the people who knew and loved Alessandra, they described her as someone who was resilient, like I said, but who was warm, who was quick to laugh, someone who would help anyone, even though she has very little to give. But as we know, she was also vulnerable. She was financially strained. She didn't have the strong support network that she really needed. And it's devastating, but in Brazil, many young women seem to live in that space, constantly having to negotiate their safety because saying no, that could mean losing the very little income that you have. Alessandra had met Jorge, Izabela and Bruna because she was looking for work. And more than that, she was looking for a way to survive. So the three of them, they presented themselves as a household who were looking for help, who were looking for a stable, steady worker who would come in as often as they needed. And to Alessandra, it finally seemed like she was getting the job that she craved all along, something permanent, something stable. And when this opportunity arose, she approached it with all the hope in the world. Now, Jorge, of course, too, has two women entourage, Izabela and Bruna. He acts as though coming across Alessandra was part of his divine plan. He would study Alessandra with a smug, entitled confidence. He could see that this woman was desperate, and instead of offering help, he had just interpreted this as a sign from the universe that everything he believes has been right all along. Now, this household, it was strange from the moment Alessandra walked in, and it's not because it was dirty, it's not because it was chaotic. It was just wrong in the kind of way that's obvious but very hard to articulate, like that gut feeling that you can get, you know, when you walk into a house of three weirdos. It was like the air had this sense of artificial care and calm that was masking something rotten underneath. Now, Izabela and Bruna, they were polite, but they would later say themselves that they were being overly polite. The kind of politeness that has quite clearly been rehearsed and is not a genuine response to human connection. And then you've got Jorge, the weirdo who looks like if he was chocolate, he would eat himself. He was sitting there like an emperor whose kingdom had been made out of cardboard, but still thought everyone should bow down to him. Alessandra had no idea that what she was walking into wasn't a job interview. These people were auditioning her for an ideology that Jorge had made up. Alessandra sat there with them. She spoke about her life. She spoke about the struggles, the fact that she was looking for steady work, and those small necessary dreams that she had for a better life. She had a desire to be able to support herself and one day potentially support a family. And while she is giving her soul and bearing it to these three cretins, Jorge's just watching her in a way that shows that he was mentally studying her, measuring her against his imaginary moral checklist. He had decided within minutes of meeting Alessandra that she fell into his category of an impure woman. Impure to him meant disposable. Impure meant useful, but only as an offering to his twisted identity. Impure to him meant that he could use her suffering as part of his so-called divine mission. When he seen Alessandra, he seen her as a perfect target to prove himself to his large cult, that large cult of 2 women. He could prove to them that he was a man of action, a man of purpose, that he was a prophet. Now, Izabela and Bruna, they said that their world had shrunk so tightly around Jorge's ego that even they couldn't see Alessandra's humanity. I don't buy the BS. Like, don't give me that crap. Like, I know that people can be brainwashed, I get it, but this is one man, and there's 2 followers. There's a reason this man has not picked up more followers along the way, because he even struggles to convince himself. But Izabela and Bruna, they had seen her as the first assignment that needed to be complete. They didn't see her as a woman with a history, a family, a personality, a life worth living. She was just an assignment in Jorge's project. So Jorge, whilst he is sitting with Alessandra and his 2 women, he starts to tell Alessandra about his prophecy, about his action plan, all his beliefs, how he was this higher up, how he was sent from God, blah, 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 blah. And Alessandra, being polite, she humours him. She stays longer than what she anticipated. She listens to his ramblings, and she doesn't sense the danger at first. She thinks she's just met this man and his 2 wives who are very eccentric. And after all, to Alessandra, she thought she was meeting people who were willing to give her an opportunity. She thought it would be polite to listen to what he had to say. She gave them the benefit of the doubt because she couldn't afford not to. But Alessandra, with her kindness, with her vulnerability, and her hope for stability, she wouldn't leave that house alive. As Alessandra is sitting there, she doesn't feel the shift in the dynamic at first. She doesn't realise that it's turning sinister. But she is in this small, suffocating little room with Jorge and the 2 women. And Jorge is just performing for the audience. He is lapping up. He's loving the attention. He's explaining his philosophy to Alessandra as if she had came in here with the idea that she wanted to join his cult, which she frickin' didn't. She's here for a cleaning job, and somehow she's having to listen to this guy spit bars as if he knows what he's talking about. So he starts talking in circles. Morality and purity, purifying, cleansing, la-di-la-di-la-di-la. All of the favourite vocabulary buzzwords of the men who are cowards with a god complex. And Alessandra, she smiles, she nods, she is politely trying to keep up with these ramblings that just don't make one bit of sense. And that is something that you see with women around men that they can tell are unstable. They try and perform safety. They try and protect themselves. Smile when really you want to leave. Be agreeable when really you feel uneasy. And pretend to be interested so you can find an exit later. Then at some point, the atmosphere in this house, it shifts completely. It turns dark, it turns dangerous. Jorge's voice had completely changed. It was less about the prophecy, less philosophical and far more commanding. He told her things about her own life that he couldn't possibly know and were completely made up, by the way. He did not have a tiny rat's ass of an idea of what he was actually saying, let's be honest. But he was phrasing them like accusations as if he was fully in the know. Jorge told Alessandra that she carried impurity, that she had violated the divine order, and that the sacred feminine demanded a cleansing. And his 2 followers, one wife by marriage and the other by complete delusion, they stood behind him like shadows holding up his delusion. Alessandra still is being polite, she is being careful with her words. She says she has somewhere to be and she politely asks if she could leave. But, they'll meet up again soon, they can talk further. Anything to try and reassure them that she wasn't clocking on to them. So Alessandra, she stands up, she is polite, but she's very firm. She insisted that she had to leave now. And instead, like a normal household of Jorge, Izabela and Bruna helping her gather her things and escorting her out the house, Jorge would block her path. And the 2 women, they stood there like reinforcement. Jorge then started to recite his manifesto of complete idiocracy. Like, this guy truly thinks that if he reads it out loud, it's going to make him righteous instead of pathetic. When Alessandra is trying to be more firm, when she tries to push past this man, he reacts with a fastness that he usually doesn't possess. And these cowards like Jorge, Izabela and Bruna, they usually react quickest when they can feel resistance. And at that moment, Jorge would lunge at Alessandra. He grabs her. Alessandra starts screaming out. She screams out for help, but that house was so isolated, no one heard her. And even if someone had, They probably would have been ignored because of the kind of neighbourhood that they were in. Screams would often be ignored because everyone's fighting their own battles. No one wants to be involved in anyone's business. Whilst Alessandra tries to fight off Jorge, these other two women, these two scumbags who should have been like sisters, who should have been allies, who should have been her protectors, they did nothing. And in fact, actually, no, they did worse than nothing. They held this woman. Izabela would grab her arms and Bruna had grabbed her legs. And not a single one of them flinched. Not a single one of them was bothered by what they were doing to this young woman. And I'm sorry, but I think it takes a special kind of moral collapse for a woman to hold down another woman whilst a man attacks her. And let me get this straight, they weren't possessed, they weren't controlled, the both of them, they were willing. And then Jorge, with the confidence of a man who has never been challenged in his own home, he grabs a knife and he starts to attack Alessandra. This wouldn't be quick and it definitely wasn't merciful. He was prolonging this because he wanted to make an example of her to his two scumbag followers. This was to prove to them that he wasn't just a man of theory, he was a man of action. He stabbed this young woman repeatedly, fueled by his fantasies of moral supremacy. Alessandra was trying to scream, she was trying to fight back, but her breath left her body too fast. And the two women, they didn't look away. They watched the life leave another woman, a woman who just trusted these three people, who had entered the wrong house on the wrong day. When Alessandra's body finally went still, the house didn't fall into silence. There wasn't a moment of realisation of what they had just committed. Jorge, he continues preaching as if anyone is listening. He then proceeds to tell the women that they had contributed to a holy act. He had framed Alessandra's murder as purification. He had rationalised that her blood was spiritual currency, and he had turned this brutality into some kind of sick and twisted ceremony. But this is the thing that desperate, cowardly men do, especially when they have the dying need to feel powerful. Alessandra's lifeless body would be dragged to the back of this house, and let me tell you, she wasn't treated like a human. Not at all. Jorge would supervise whilst he and the two women dismembered Alessandra's body bit by bit. They cut, they cleaned, they separated bone from flesh. They reduced this woman's entire existence into pieces that were manageable enough for them to carry or cook. And just when you think it can't get any more sick and it can't get any more disturbing, this trio of weirdos, this trio of cretin scumbag losers, they decide what they're going to do is make empadas, meat, pastries out of Alessandra's flesh. They would heat up parts of her bodies in roasting pans and pots on top of the stove. They had mixed her flesh with spices and with dough to create small pastries that they then ate, and then others that they sold. Yeah, they were selling pastries made of a woman to the public. Bone fragments, tissue, internal remains, these were all placed in shallow pits behind the house. Some sections of her body had been wrapped up in regular, trash bags, and these were disposed of as you would dispose of any household waste, and then ended up in some kind of wasteland. When this entire act was over, Jorge had deemed it to be a success. He had told his two women followers that the sacred feminine had been very, very pleased. I'd be like, who is the sacred feminine, Jorge? Can we speak to them? Are they in the room with us right now? He had convinced these women that they had ascended to a higher level of purity by annihilating another woman. And they believed him, because they're as dumb as they come. And the thing is here is that violence can become a habit for people who mistake evil for purpose. And after this first kill, they believed that they were agents of a higher power, something larger, something spiritual, something that excused every horrifying action. And then we come to Jessica Camila, another young woman who didn't grow up captivated by danger or drawn into chaos. She had grown up juggling survival in a world that had punished women for being young, for being poor, for being polite, or for simply being visible. Being born into a low-income household, Jessica had learned how you would stretch one day's worth of food into 3 days. How to manage responsibilities before your childhood was even finished. Honestly, not really having a childhood at all. Having to grow up early, having to be able to help in the household. But above all else, she had learned how to stay hopeful when hope itself felt like a luxury. She was described as being bright and warm. She was a kind of woman who just kept pushing forward, no matter how much life had knocked her down. By her late teens, she was already navigating motherhood. She was raising her daughter. Her daughter was her entire world. And she was determined to give her daughter a better childhood than what she had. To give her a better life. To give her stability. To give her daughter hope. Jessica was someone who had loved, who had lost, and who had rebuilt. She had this kind of determination that a lot of people seem to romanticise until they realise just how exhausting that is. But again, like the other women, she also had her vulnerabilities. Financially, she was completely strained. Emotionally, she was completely drained. And I'm not trying to rhyme here. I don't know why I'm sitting like spitting bars and rapping when I'm telling this case, but somehow it just happened. But emotionally, she had been stretched so thin, and she lived a life where she was having to rely on people who didn't always have her best interests at heart. And the thing is, a young mother living in poverty, a lot of the time they were forced to trust complete strangers because that's the only hope they had. There was no other options for her. There was no safety net. There was no margin for error. If someone offers you a job or a place to stay or even a sympathetic ear, you consider it. And that is how she met Jorge, Izabela and Bruna. By 2012, this throuple, they had moved to a new house in Garanhuns. And of course, like many other of these sickos, they believed that that first murder made them untouchable. Now, when Jessica went to meet this throuple, yet again, she is misled. She believes that there's going to be talks of a job, stable employment, and she didn't have any childcare. So that day when she goes to visit them, she brings her daughter along, and they offer her work, shelter, and support. And this is bait that works on people like Jessica, people who are dreaming of a better life. And they knew this. That's exactly why they used that bait. When Jessica stepped into their home, she didn't step in with fear. She stepped in with hope. Hope for a better life, hope for a better future. She had no idea that she was walking into these 3 monsters who have already killed another innocent woman. She didn't know that they believed that killing young women was a divine service. She only seen and believed that these were 3 people who were so eager to offer support. As you can imagine, inside this house, the routine was already scripted. Jorge, he starts going on and on and on, his ramblings, his sermons, just shouting from the rooftops, thinking that he is God's gift. He was pacing and gesturing like a man who believed that he carried divine authority. And nothing really happens at first. Nothing too loud, there's nothing too sudden, nothing big enough that would scare off a woman who needs help. They let Jessica relax, they let her daughter settle. They let that illusion of safety take control. And we know already that this is their pattern. They disarm the victim with safety, with warmth, before revealing the death trap. But then suddenly, when everything's calm, Jorge announces to Jessica that she's impure. He could spot it a mile off apparently, using that same flimsy justification that they would use for every murder. And at that point, Jessica immediately senses a danger, and the first thing on her mind is getting her daughter out of there. She quickly gathers up her young daughter and she moves toward the door. She is already in survival mode. But the trio, the throuple, the weirdos, they step into position like this is now a rehearsed routine. They've all got their designated place in this dance. Izabela swoops in and seizes her arms, and then Bruna goes behind her and seizes her legs. And Jorge, he blocks off the exit. He is barking orders like the petty tyrant that he believed himself to be. Now Jessica, she fought with such ferocity that they weren't prepared for it. She resisted every second. She resisted every order like a young mother desperate to save her child, because that is exactly what she was. Now her struggle had rattled them, and in particular it had rattled Jorge, because what's going on here? Why is this female fighting back? I mean, after all, he works for the sacred feminine. He desperately wanted to drag this out longer, but because Jessica fought so hard, he loses it. His control out the window, non-existent. He grabs the knife and he just starts attacking her in front of her daughter. And this attack, it was clumsy, it was frantic, it was just fueled by his own collapsing ego. And the entire time, that Jessica is being attacked the entire time that she is fighting for her life. She is screaming for her daughter. She is screaming for her daughter to try and run. She's telling her daughter that she loves her. Even as Jessica fell to the ground, she fought. She battled. She was doing her best to cling to life. When her body finally went still, when she couldn't fight anymore, this throuple took her body into the back room of the house, and we know what's going to happen here. They cut her into sections, they separate the limbs, they remove the internal parts, and after dismembering her, they again cook portions of her remains. Again, it was mixed with spices, it was mixed with dough, and then they consumed it as part of their purification ritual. And one of the darkest parts of Jessica's death is the fact that her daughter, they decide they're going to keep her. They tell this little girl that their mother has went to sleep and that she won't wake up again. They position themselves to society as a new family, and they use this little girl's presence to reinforce their warped ideology. This little girl would live with them for months, absorbing horrors that she should never have been exposed to. Horrors that she didn't fully understand until investigators were able to remove her from that house. See, the thing is, they didn't actually debate what they needed to do with the little girl, because that would cause a moral awakening of sorts, or would it really with these cretins? I don't know. And neither of these women had any intention of wakening up. Instead, this child was embraced as if she was a prize, as if she was a trophy after this murder. A trophy of loyalty, a reward for obedience. That is how she was seen. A living justification for the horror that they had just committed. Now, they gave this girl food, they gave her comfort, they gave her a bed, but they stole her mother. They try and tell themselves that they're saving her from Jessica, this impure woman, that they're going to raise her to be better. When in reality, they're just so desperately trying to rewrite the history of what they've just done. And this child becomes a centerpiece of their brand new identity. And that should tell you just how far these people have fallen. Because real parents, they see their children as a person. They see them as people. But this trio seen her as part of Jorge's script. When he held this little girl, he didn't cradle her, he didn't love her, he didn't show adoration. He showcased this little girl as if she was evidence that he had been chosen. And when Izabela and Bruna, when they're ordered to care for this little girl, it's not because they want to. It's not a maternal instinct. It was delusional obligation. Now, Jorge, he hated whenever this little girl would cry. It seemed to puncture his fantasy, you know, it disrupted the illusion that he was building a spiritual family. So he would tell the women to keep her quiet, to soothe her, to shut her up. Always keep her close. He wanted the usefulness of this child, but he did not want the inconvenience of her grief, you know, after witnessing her own mother be murdered in front of her. Over time, this trio, they start telling strangers and neighbours that this little girl was theirs. They crafted various different lies, and they done it with such ease. Now, to neighbours, the girl was adopted, but to strangers, the girl was someone they had rescued. You know, always making themselves look morally above the rest. And as most children are, this little girl was like a sponge, just absorbing everything around her. She very quickly realised that Jorge was someone to be obeyed, that Izabela and Bruna were his followers. She had learned that questions were frowned upon and that silence was safer than curiosity. Over time, this little girl's memories of her mother, they start to blur, replaced by routines, commands, and that quiet, unspoken ache that follows children who know they have lost something or someone fundamental. Now, Jorge, yet again, he is just growing stronger and stronger for this itch to kill another victim. Or, in this case, he says he's looking for his next sign. You know, the next impure soul to help boost his ego. And that sign would arrive in the form of a young woman by the name of Giselle. Giselle, again, she had grown up poor, bounced between unstable living situations. And she had entered adulthood with the kind of scars that not only come from physical abuse, but emotional neglect. Despite everything that she had been through, she was never hardened, she was never cynical. She yet again was another young woman full of hope. She was soft-spoken, she was sincere, she was very trusting of everyone that she met. And she's young, she is navigating life with very minimal resources that she has, working whatever temporary jobs come her way. Her plan for life was very simple. Keep working, keep surviving. Just keep pushing forward, one day at a time. For people like these women, trusting strangers, it wasn't a luxury that they had. It was a complete necessity, because when you don't have a support system around you, you don't get to be picky about who you trust and about who you let in. Now, Giselle, she had met Jorge during an unsolicited interaction. She was very polite, she was endearing, and Jorge, he noticed her vulnerability right away. It's like he could sniff it out of these women. But that's something that these predators are able to do. They can spot exhaustion, they can spot instability. When Giselle's talking to Jorge and eventually Izabela and Bruna, she drops in the fact that she's looking for work. She's desperate for work, in fact. And this trio, that I can only describe as being a trapped door disguised by an open hand, they say, hey, we've got work. Come with us. We'll talk about a work opportunity, no problem. The pitch was always the same: a safe space, a job, somewhere to rest, some shelter. It was something that these young women could not turn down. Now, Giselle, she visits the trio just weeks after Jessica's murder. And when she arrives, she doesn't have any fear, but there is this sense of confusion. Now, Jorge, he would spend the entire conversation sizing her up, cataloguing her emotional state, testing her responses. And to him, every single thing was an evaluation of, was she impure? Was she unprotected? Would she be missed? Would she fight? Now, this trio, they had become so reckless, so arrogant, and believing that this pattern they had created made any actual sense. And they were bold enough to repeat it in the same frickin' town as their previous victim. And everything seemed to happen so fast. One moment, Giselle is listening to these crazy ass ramblings by Jorge, and then the next minute, she finds herself in the same ambush as the previous two women. Izabela again grabs her arms, Bruna again grabs her legs, and Jorge, as per, positioned himself at the front. And Giselle fought. She fought hard, just like the others. She resisted with every bit of instinct that she had. But ultimately, 3-on-1 is 3-on-1. She was outnumbered and therefore she was overpowered. And Jorge proceeded to attack her in the same violent outburst that he had done twice previously, stabbing this young woman to death whilst his two followers pinned her to the ground. He turned her death yet again into another performance to feed his ego. And yet again, the minute her body went still, the trio, they transition into the next stage of purification. And after Giselle's murder, the three of these losers, they genuinely believe that they've perfected a system. I mean, come on, they've done it 3 times now. They've fed Jorge's ego 3 times. Not only that, but they've deepened the women's obedience. And they truly believed that the world was blind to them, blind to the higher divine. But the thing is, the world doesn't stay blind. Sometimes it just takes a while for everyone to fully open their eyes. And in Garanhuns, people noticed things. And it wasn't because they were outwardly suspicious or outwardly overly weird. I mean, we all know they are weird, they're freaks, but still. But the people weren't suspicious by nature. They were suspicious because this trio was becoming very sloppy. Because the thing is, when you murder someone, it doesn't just temporarily stain your hands. It stains your living space, it stains your routine, and it stains your behaviour. And this trio, they start to forget that the normal people outside of their home, they're not living in the script of a cult. Their eyes are opened a lot wider. Now, during the night, neighbours start to hear very strange noises. Muffled sounds, there's thudding, there's shuffling through the house, voices that are getting louder and louder, falling into a rhythm that suggested there was a bit of a panic going on. And most people, at first, they ignore this. But after a while, the noises that they're hearing, they become impossible to dismiss. And suddenly, people's eyes and ears were opening up to the fact that something was wrong in that house. And the thing is, Jorge, he really thinks that they're so discreet with their disposal of the bodies of these women. But the thing is, you can be careful in your disposal, you can do all the cleaning that you possibly can, but decomposition of a body doesn't lie. That scent had seeped into the walls, it had seeped into the yard, into the spaces between the homes, and the neighbours, they could smell it. And they start wondering and discussing between them, you know, this family's always talking about the meat that they're selling, the meat that they're storing. We're starting to wonder what that meat is. But the biggest crack in the trio's foundation, it wasn't going to be the smell of the meat or the blood stains on their sofa. It would be the little girl. Because this little girl, she starts repeating things out loud. Really odd ramblings that she had heard from Jorge. She started saying odd phrases about the woman who went to sleep and didn't wake up. And children don't invent those kind of statements. They absorb them and they repeat them. One day this little girl is out in the neighbourhood and concerned neighbours, being polite and friendly, they talk to her. They ask her what she's doing, like what game's she playing. And the little girl starts to tell them about the woman who was cut and went to sleep. And that was a moment for these neighbours where the alarm bells start ringing louder and louder. This was no longer curiosity or speculation. This was a situation that needed to be investigated. Now, inside the house, Jorge himself, he hadn't noticed this outward shift because men with egos like that are usually blind to the facts. He believed that everything was under control because he said it was. Izabela and Bruna, however, they felt the unease. They could tell that something wasn't quite right, that people were becoming a bit suspicious. They were followers and they were idiots, but they weren't completely stupid. They noticed the glances from neighbours. They noticed that the doors would shut whenever the trio would walk by, that conversations would come to a halt whenever the trio approached the neighbours. They knew that their lives were becoming harder to hide. So they try and control the little girl. They try and tell her what to say, what not to say, who to speak to, who not to speak to, and honestly, just to not go outside. But the thing with children that is so great is that they're open books and they are not machines. And sometimes if you give them an instruction, they're gonna forget it. They speak freely and they repeat things that they've heard adults say. Now, meanwhile, Giselle's absence, that hadn't went unnoticed. Her family, they might not have had money, but they had love. They were grieving their daughter. They didn't know if she was dead or alive, but they were grieving her presence being missing. The unravelling of this trio accelerated the day that Jorge lost control of himself. He started talking too much. He started dropping these hints about cleansing and purification. And he was just dropping it into casual conversation as if anybody else was talking about it. He would brag about his mission in ways that might have sounded metaphorical to strangers, but to him were very much real. He believed in this moment that he was untouchable, and that thought alone made him reckless. Now, the neighbour that had spoken to the little girl, they decided they had to go to the police, and they told the police, listen, something is wrong in that house. I can't tell you exactly what it is. I'm not sure, but please trust me. Something is wrong, something's going on. And this came from worry, intuition, and also the echoes of what that little girl had said. Now, the police, they don't rush in straight away. They do their preliminary checks, they do interviews, they talk with the neighbours, and they do some surveillance. Not only that, but they start to trace disappearances that could possibly be linked to this trio. And that's when Jessica's name pops up. Jessica, who was a mother to a young little girl. Her family had filed a missing person report. Her mother had spoke to every neighbour in every street to try and get some answers. And then they come across Alessandra's disappearance, the one that took place around a year earlier. Another woman who had disappeared from the margins. Officers at this point, they still don't have a reason to enter that home, but they know that they need to find something. They need to get hard evidence so they can go inside. One day they're in the neighbourhood. They've been talking to the neighbours again, trying to gather some facts, and they spot the little girl outside. They decide they're going to go over and talk to her. So they ask her, where's your mother, sweetheart? And this little girl's answer was brutally simple. She tells them that her mother went to sleep and that she never woke up. And whilst this is harrowing for the officers to hear, it's not exactly concrete. But then she said something else that was completely unmistakable. That these people had cut her mother and that she didn't wake up. And that right there was a moment that everything shifted. And officers, they don't storm in right away. They file it, they consult with people, they try and get advice on the best way to approach this situation. They interviewed people who knew the victims. They started to map the disappearances. And this trio, they were no longer the odd household in the street. They were the point of interest. And the police, they increase surveillance, but still they don't have anything concrete, nothing that will allow them to enter the house. And then a neighbour comes forward and tells them a detail that no one else had dared to share. And that was that young woman, Jessica, who they now know has been reported missing, they seen her enter that house and they never seen her leave. And that was the final piece that the police needed. And from that moment, they secured their warrant. Officers approach the house, they do it calmly, they do it quietly, they just knock on the door, very polite. But inside, this trio felt something shift. They knew just from looking at Jorge's posture that this was all coming crashing down. When investigators enter that home, they immediately get to work. They are looking for evidence, they are asking all the right questions. And then they find it. Bone fragments, tissue, dismembered limbs. Human material where human material should never be. And then of course they find a manuscript. You know, Jorge's beloved doctrine. The rambling gospel of the very man who had turned misogyny into his own religion. Now the trio, they would be arrested, and Jorge, he starts protesting and shouting and telling neighbours, don't worry, the police have got it wrong, they don't know what they're talking about, meh, 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 crying like a little baby. Izabela cried, she denied, and then she folded into silence, and Bruna, she tries to cling to purpose. But as soon as she was taken away from Jorge, the whole thing cracked. And this little girl, that innocent child who witnessed the brutal murder of her own mother, she was finally saved from that house. So of course the trio, they would be interrogated, and Jorge, as we know, loves the sound of his own voice. So they just let him talk and talk and talk and talk. They basically give him the rope to hang himself. And my God, that is exactly what he did. Now the first crack, it would appear when officers, they just start asking simple questions. Not philosophical ones, just very practical ones. Where are the missing women? Why are missing women's belongings being found in your home? Why did the child report violence? Why do neighbours hear screams? Why does your manuscript describe rituals involving death? And Jorge, being the asswipe that he is, he tries to deny, deflect, and then he just starts preaching. He is trying to preach to the officers and the investigators to come around to his way of thinking. When the officers place photos of the women in front of Jorge, this is when he went into complete panic. He was faced with exactly what he had done. And he actually tries to reframe the murders as a necessary act. He tried to claim that it was all down to purity. He also tries to hide behind his vocabulary that, anyone could look in the dictionary and look up the meaning of a word and then insert it into their daily lives. We've all done it. But every single time this man opened his mouth, the officers were just hearing another fricking contradiction. Delusional ramblings that made zero sense. And then Izabela, she folds like a cheap suit. Bruna, she folds like a deck chair. It all comes crashing down and they start revealing the secrets of the throuple. Exactly what is going on, the beliefs, the rituals, the prophecy, the manuscript, the delusions, everything, the murders, the dismemberment, the child who bore witness to something so frickin' heinous and horrifying. And that was it. There was no denying that each and every single one of them shared involvement. The day that trio walked into court, that performance was over before it even started. Because the prosecution, they didn't need theatrics. They had the evidence. They had the confessions and they had the child who had survived them. Now Jorge, he is desperately trying to reclaim his role as the philosopher king of his own fantasy. He had walked with this feigned kind of dignity, like he honestly was walking like he had a stick right up his ass. Answering questions as though he was a professor lecturing his students. It was so pathetic and hilarious to watch. But what he didn't realise is that the courtroom wasn't his stage. Every time he opened his mouth, the prosecution just used his own manifesto against him. Word for word, line by line. And the most humiliating part to Jorge was the fact that when psychiatrists had evaluated him, they stripped away this mystique that he had built around himself for as long as he can remember. They described him as a delusional narcissist. He was manipulative and he was delusional in a way that served his ego. But the man wasn't insane. He was just self-serving. Now, when the sentencing had arrived, there was no suspense. Not when you've got the evidence that the prosecution had. The evidence had spoken for itself, the confessions had spoken for themselves, the psychology had spoken, the child had spoken. There was nothing left for them to cling on to. Now, because of the way that the crimes had taken place, the fact that they were done in multiple places, there would be multiple different trials. I believe there was, 3 trials altogether. So instead of giving you the individual convictions from each sentence, I'm just going to give you the overall conviction that all 3 of them received. So Jorge, he would be sentenced to 98 years in prison. Izabela received 92 years, and Bruna Cristina, she received 95 years in prison. All 3 of them had been convicted of murder, dismemberment and concealment of a corpse, cannibalism, and aggravating circumstances. Now this trio, they would go to prison not as a cult, but just as 3 sick individuals that had no more lies to hide behind. And whilst I am glad that they are spending their lives in prison, that they will never get the chance to hurt another person. The sentences here, they don't resurrect Alessandra, they don't resurrect Jessica, and they don't resurrect Giselle. They don't heal that little girl's trauma for the things that she witnessed. Because unfortunately, justice doesn't undo harm. It doesn't undo murder. It only prevents the guilty party for creating more of it. But these verdicts, they did give the families of the victims something that can be really rare, and that is clarity, answers, and most importantly, the truth. As always, this video today is dedicated to the victims. It is dedicated to the victims' families. And I can only hope and pray that wherever these victims are resting now, that they're resting peacefully. And I hope getting the clarity and the answers allow the families the opportunity to heal to at least some degree. And I just hope and pray that that little girl has received the support, the love, the warmth that she deserves to try and heal as best as she can from what she endured and what she had to witness. But my loves, that is it for another true crime episode. I really hope this one was interesting. It felt like such an important case to tell, as I've not really seen it spoken about. And it's honestly, it never fails to baffle me that this kind of evil exists, that these people exist. Like, how the hell do we have people like this who still wander the earth? There is people out there who are still doing this. It baffles me. Before you leave this video today, please don't forget to leave a like, comment and subscribe. Hype the video if YouTube will allow you. I don't know why it's taken away that feature, because it was really helping my channel, and I feel like they've realised that and been like, nah, not for you anymore, Anna. I hope you're all having a lovely Sunday so far. I hope you have a brilliant week ahead. I'm so excited to see you again on Wednesday. But with that being said, please, please, please remember, be a good person. Do not be a bad person. Stay safe. Look after each other. Don't join a freaking cult with a little podgy man telling you his ramblings. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.